Welcome back to the Agriland Pavilion here at the National Ploughing Championships in Ratheniska in County Laois. It's still a bit windy outside, but you can probably see from my squinting it's a bit brighter, so we are hoping that the sun is going to come out, and the next 2 days at the ploughing will be very enjoyable. I think they're enjoyable for the people who are here. They're all happy jumping in the muck outside. But inside here, where we're a bit drier and a bit cleaner, I'm joined by MEP Colm Markey and Holly Cairns from the Social Democrats. First of all, thank you for joining us today here at the ploughing. You've been getting around, I'm sure, and chatting to people. But Colm, I might go to you first. And I suppose as an MEP and a dairy farmer yourself, I can't but talk to you about the decision in relation to nitrates derogation, which came from Europe recently, and the fact that the Minister went out, spoke to the Environment Commissioner, and there's going to be no further derogation, allowing farmers to, have 250 kilos of organic nitrogen, and that will be down to 220 from January. You're keenly aware, I suppose, of what sort of impact this has on the dairy industry. What's your own feeling on it?
Yeah, I suppose, there's some of our most progressive dairy farmers will be impacted by this, and they will have to see stock cuts, I think, and that's a concern. I suppose, I had my own meeting with the Commissioner last week, and he was very particular to say that he didn't want to see any animals slaughtered as a result of this. So I think we have to look at ways in which we can ensure that, if you like, the productive element of the dairy sector can continue to maintain the production, because I think this is vital. We all know we've issues in relation to water quality. I suppose my concern about that is I don't believe that the nitrates derogation is necessarily the way that solves that problem. If you look at the work of the ASSEP programme, for instance, where individual measures and individual farms identifying, if you like, risk areas or risk issues on a farm and addressing with them specifically is a way in which we need to really address water quality issues, whether it be grey water off farmyards, whether it be the roadways, whether it be fencing off drains and leaving boundaries outside the drains. All these things make a real difference and a practical difference on the ground. And I think that's when you consider the history of the nitrates directive, it was really I think it's 1.3 cows per hectare in Ireland. Holland is 4.3 cows per hectare. So you're talking about a whole different level of concentration of livestock, and you're also talking about a very big pig industry on top of that. So the actual level of nitrates being on the ground in somewhere like Holland is completely different. There's two things about Ireland, if you like, in terms of our growing season is 330 days. People have the notion we've the derogation because in some way we didn't get our act together and didn't, almost like septic tanks or something like that we didn't get our act together. In reality, that's not the case. We've a derogation because we grow grass for a much longer season, and therefore we've the potential to absorb much more nitrogen, to grow 14 tonne of grass, whereas you're talking 7 or 8 tonne of grass in a lot of the continent. So it's for a different reason. And I think it's important that, yes, we have to get our water quality right, but we have to make sure that it's about solving the problems that are causing that, and not just this blanket approach. And that's where I'd be worried about. Right, we potentially can live with the 220. I think there's things we can do in relation to that to mitigate its impact. But we have to make sure we protect that 220, number one. And there's small measures we can take around the valuation given the calves, which maybe only last on a farm for a short period of time before they're moved off. So, them calves are much lighter than a yearling, so I think there's calculation changes. So are you saying
there's a little bit of wiggle room? Not wiggle room in terms of the actual figure. The 220 is 220, and that's coming in on the 1st of January. But you're fairly informed.
The conversation I had with the Commissioner there last week was very much about working within the existing framework to see the adjustments we could manage within the existing framework. So things like how we go about perhaps exporting slurry or managing slurry, how we value the calves, and different measures we can take within the system that will allow farmers perhaps to maintain their productivity and their production while still managing to come within that 220 figure. I think I was just listening to Joe Patton there earlier, and in reality the point is too that perhaps at times we're not getting the maximum production vis-a-vis the number of stock we have in farm, and sometimes farms are overstocked anyway, and it's actually more efficient to come back a bit as well. So there's a few balances in there, and there's a journey to go on, but I think we have to recognise the reason why we've a nitrates derogation, and it's not we've some of the best water quality in Europe, right? It's not going the right way, and it's going backwards. Not particularly fast, but it is going the wrong way, and I think we need to address that. But that's not the real issue. The real issue here is we've the potential to grow an enormous amount of grass, and that's why it's so important.
Holly, you're no stranger to farming yourself. You know, yourself and your mother have a mixed farm in Cork. And I know that you and your party have been critical of, I suppose, maybe the government's roadmap to reduce our emissions in this country. We do have to reduce them by 25% for the agricultural sector. Do you feel that there's a more definite structure on that now, or a more definite roadmap, or do you still have concerns?
I still have massive concerns, and I think like this day or this past few weeks have been inevitable. We've known for some time that there are environmental constraints around our agricultural production. That's been no secret. The government have been aware of that, farming organisations have been aware of that, farmers, everybody in Teagasc, we've all known it. And instead of sort of preparing for that inevitability, there's been a real kind of denial of the fact that it's happening. And what we've seen now over the past week is kind of a feigned outrage about the whole situation, a feigned shock, I think. And from what Colm's saying here and what Fine Gael have been saying in general is a continued kind of head in the sand approach. Continue with business as usual, keep trying to push those constraints. And look, our view would be that what farmers deserve at the very least is honesty, but at best stability. And if we don't change our approach to this, we will see constant cliff edges like this. You know, ultimately, even the minister renewed the nitrate derogation fairly recently. Even though he would have known this was coming down the line, I'm not sure why he did that. At that time, I said, you're walking farmers to a cliff edge because there's no time to prepare. And here we are at the cliff edge. And what are we hearing? We need to fight back. We need to try and keep the derogation that we have. We need to then keep it at 220, all of these things, instead of saying, what do we need to provide stability for the sector? Because one thing as well that I think isn't discussed enough in this conversation is, for one, just that reality. But then secondly, the impact that these kind of debates and discussions have on our agricultural sector, because obviously it's hugely important kind of culturally, and myself and Colm will both know that if you grew up in a rural community, it provides a lot of employment, jobs, and all of that is really important in keeping our rural schools open, our post offices. The knock-on effect of farms closing up shop is huge and detrimental. But there's also the economic value of agriculture in terms of our exports. Very, very important for us as a nation. And the reason people pay extra for a brand like Kerrygold is because Ireland has a green brand. You know, we've always been so proud of our agricultural sector. Yeah. And when we have conversations like this about how we want to keep our, special treatment in terms of adding more nitrogen, that jeopardizes that green brand. And I think it's high time we said, what do we want the future of this sector to be? Do we want Ireland to be the country that's held up as the example of the most sustainable food production, of genuinely green production? I think we do. And is this head in the sand approach going to achieve that? No. We're going to be walking to the next cliff edge for farmers. And I think, look, I remember I grew up on a small dairy farm initially. And when the milk quotas were lifted by Fine Gael, a lot of small farms became unviable because of the intensification of the sector. I know what it feels like to be in that position as a farmer where you're going, and now what are we supposed to do now, And we had to diversify now, like you say, we've mixed farm, we've dry stock, we've seed production, we have some forestry as well. But the reality is, for these farmers now, what is the best kind of remedy for this? Is it to say we'll continue with this approach and walk you to the next cliff edge?
It's a complete misrepresentation of the situation. The reality is that farmers are all up for a transition to a more sustainable scenario. The frustration with farmers is it's all this generalistic suggestion that just a unilateral figure will make the difference. The reality is it's the individual actions on the ground, but the like of the Teagasc work with the ASAP programme and things like that'll make a real difference. Like you talk about this as if it's the whole sector. The reality is there's only 5% of the sector.
Colm,
even
you're
just
an
one,
MEP. I didn't interrupt you. You interrupted me there. You're an MEP. Did you think there might be at some point a directive in relation to nitrates?
Oh, okay, finish
that. Was an inevitability, was it not?
Let Colm finish his point and then I'll come back to Holly.
The point is that certainly we have to address the situation as regards nitrates, and certainly we have to work within a derogation on whatever level that derogation is at. And there was a programme agreed a number of years ago. I've no issue with that. My point is that the real meaningful difference is that we can maintain the derogation we have because water quality will improve if we deal with the issues on the ground. And talking about the derogation for most farmers is somewhat of a distraction from dealing with the real issues, because it's the individual issues on the individual
individual farms that will make a real difference. If you'd let me finish the point I was making, you're the one that cut across me actually, because I was pointing out that, with all due respect, that 5% of farms are under derogation. Half of those farms won't be affected by the going down to 220. So you're talking about 2,500 farms. Are you suggesting it's just them that's the problem? It's across a whole sector. We have to make sure we manage nitrates correctly. We have to look at how we can reduce methane emissions within the sector. This idea that we can just stop farming and it'll all go away.
No.
The product will be produced somewhere else, and it'll be produced at a much lesser sustainable footprint than we have here.
No, I know what you're saying there, Colm. I think what Holly was trying to say is not that basically, that you're
Nobody's
promoting
putting
a
their head in the
derogation or
sand.
promoting nitrates and poor water quality. I think what she was saying is that in terms of planning for the future, farms need a bit of time. So rather than constantly going, if we know the writing is on the wall, we have climate change, we need to, everyone in the world needs to just change and adapt new methodologies. Correct me if I'm wrong, Holly is just trying to say, should we not start getting on the bandwagon and getting ahead of it?
If you take, for instance, my own role, last January I took a group of dairy farmers, brought them together to look at the water catchments and the learnings from the water catchment programme that Teagasc run, where they take a sample every 10 minutes, and the analysis of that over a number of years. We looked at what they use as the kick test to look at the biological profile of the water, whether it's good quality or bad quality, and I'm all for bringing people on that journey. Absolutely. I actually championed it myself on a number of occasions and continue to do it. But what that taught us was the individual things that will make the difference. And this thing is saying it's all, if you're not with us, you're against us type attitude. The reality is most farmers are more than interested in doing the right thing for the environment, both in terms of water quality and in terms of and for that matter in terms of animal welfare as well. The question here is, what is the right thing? And the farmers on the ground, rather than saying you're just burying your head, we're not burying your head in the sand. We want to get the right answers, not just the headline answers. And definitely the Nitrates Directive is something we have to work within, but also there's so many other good things that farmers want to do, and this just kind of populist approach of suggesting that people have their head in the sand is just not true. The frustration is the real meaningful difference, like extra slurry storage, being able to let tillage farmers maybe have slurry storage on there so that we can export the nitrates. We're talking about an organic fertiliser here. So the use of that organic fertiliser most effectively is what we want to do. If you look what farmers have done over the last couple of years, they've reduced their chemical fertiliser usage and they've replaced it with a lot of organic fertiliser through using multi-species forward through clover. Farmers are all up for this. So this thing is saying that farmers are burying their head in the sand is not fair.
I will say, I don't think it's, Holly was saying farmers, I think maybe Holly was saying more politicians are burying their heads somewhat in the sand, not the farmers, because the farmers, and we had a dairy panel on here before you came on, and Jack Keenan, a farmer in Wicklow, a very moderate dairy farmer, not intensive by any means. Not that there's anything wrong with that either. Dairy is one of our biggest exports. But he was very much doing everything that he can. As he said there, he's doing the multi-species forward. He's doing less the umbilical cord. He's doing the trailing shoe. He is doing everything he possibly can. But based on his business plan, which up until 2025 was working, when he got into dairy in 2015, he's now saying that it was on course to meet the business plan targets that he had, and now it isn't because of the changes. But look, we're nobody likes change, but we have to adapt. And Holly, can I ask, if the Social Democrats were in government and they held the Department of Agriculture and Minister of Agriculture portfolio, what would you do? I mean, there's thousands of dairy farmers who don't want, now I'll have to say, they don't want to be seen as the problem. Dairy farmers aren't out in the world making a living to be a problem. They're just trying to rear their families and rear calves and rear cows. So how would they be supported under a Social Democrats Minister for Agriculture?
Can I first just address what Colm said about, you said that I said farmers are burying their head in their sand. I absolutely did not. I said that Fine Gael were burying their head in the sand and continuing with a failed approach that's walking farmers to a cliff edge. So just to be fair, I never said that. I don't believe that any farmer gets up in the morning and says, today I'd like to pollute the water. That's not a reality. I know that, you know that.
Absolutely.
Can we move on to what the Social Dems would do? Yeah.
So at this point, and look, like I said, when the Minister renewed the derogation, I think for a long time now, we should have been preparing for this inevitability. Unfortunately, I can only come in at what we would do at this moment. And there's quite a few things that I would have to say in terms of suggestions like nutrient management schemes where payments are redirected towards that rather than just how many livestock units to the hectare, where we kind of have a an actual regulator with teeth where you can kind of control prices, that most of the profit doesn't continue to go to...
Well, the Minister for Agriculture would say we have an agri-regulator and literally use the phrase with teeth.
No, we have an ombudsman, and so they can compile reports and give, kind of opinions and feedback, and that's welcome, but it's not a regulator with teeth, and that is the reality. And there's loads of things we could do in terms of diversification and encouraging farmers to do that. But the crucial thing here is that to do it successfully, you don't implement a policy on top of farmers. If we had the Ministry for Agriculture, for example, we'd be engaging with farmers saying, here is the reality and the science. In 10 years' time, this is where we're going to be at. How do we best work towards that with you? How do we redirect payments to make that financially viable? Because at the end of the day, as farmers, we're all kind of small business owners, some bigger businesses obviously in Ireland as well. But ultimately, we have to make ends meet. And at the moment, we have a situation where payments, the taxpayers' money goes directly to farmers to produce food at a lower cost. There's no such thing as cheap food. We're seeing the environmental cost of that now. And the approach of continuing with that method, constantly pushing past the environmental constraints that we already know are there, is the thing that has walked farmers to this cliff edge. And there's a lot of derogations in this country, I'm well aware of it, many of them in my own constituency. And I feel they didn't need to be walked to that cliff edge. I'm particularly concerned with the smaller farmer with a derogation, because how do you then make a profit?
But if you look at...
You knew this was coming. Can I just say,
Just...
you knew this was coming. The government knew this was coming. We all knew this was coming, but nobody will say that.
Okay, I bring in Colm. I just want to pick up on one point you mentioned about cheap food there. You have said there that the era of cheap food is over. Do people outside farming know that? Because is it the farmers that are expected to pay for this? Because if you go into some discount retail supermarkets, you're still seeing very cheap food. And sometimes I walk into, I won't mention the names, but into some supermarkets, and I literally am flabbergasted at how that product has got onto that box at that price, when I know it costs the farmer probably 3 times as much as that to produce.
Exactly.
So is it the consumer that then has to step up? Because it's consumers predominantly that are criticising agriculture for its environmental footprint, yet are they willing to, and do you feel that as a social democrat in government you could get the consumers, because no government ever wants to raise food prices, but that's essentially to get a fair price for your product as an agricultural producer, that's what needs to happen.
Because it's such an important point that we don't talk about agriculture enough. We always hear about housing policy being scrutinised, about healthcare policy being scrutinised, but agriculture never gets the same level of attention. And I think if we could try and draw a positive from this entire disaster kind of around the derogation, it's the fact that we are looking at it now. And actually what you see in agriculture is something very similar to health and housing, and that is private interests, vested interests, being very much satisfied by government policy and the outcome of that, and the small farmer is not the one benefiting. And when you think about it, this is an important conversation we need to have, because at the moment we are subsidised at the point of production to produce food for less. So then farmers become a price taker, not a price maker. Whereas if we were setting the price saying this is what we can produce it for, and then the supermarkets were buying it, and then perhaps it was subsidised, then it wouldn't be just the supermarkets making the vast majority of the profit, because at the moment it's not just supermarkets, it's fertiliser companies, it's the meat industry, it's rarely farmers. And Colm trying to make out that I'm somehow blaming farmers is actually the biggest disgrace of all of this, because to say that there's some kind of contradiction between climate and agriculture, the two are intrinsically linked. For a future of the sector, for generational renewal, what is the future?
I'm just caught for time here. I might go back to Colm on this one. Sorry, Colm.
Just to say, you suggested that this disaster that is the dairy sector, I think is the phrase used.
Well, I don't think she said the dairy sector. She said the disaster that we've landed ourselves in with
you knew the derogation was coming, nothing was done, and now suddenly people have to reduce their herd. That's a disaster.
Absolutely not the case. I was the very one that organised for dairy farmers to come and engage with the asset programme and the different situations.
And that is true. I will
now, beyond that, the reality is, as you said yourself, we've a green image, we have a green sector, we've always, our water quality, while it's not going the right direction, it's way ahead of the rest of Europe. So clearly we've done things right in agriculture, so I wouldn't be so critical of it. Now, as regards to cheap food policy, I'm also always all for more money being put in the farmer's pocket. But the reality is, we have to make sure that if we don't displace food production, we have the highest standards in the world in Europe. We have the highest standards in the world in Europe, which has been dissed and rubbished here today. And I think the replacement
replacement will be food from elsewhere in the world. Yes, we can improve on what we have. We can make the dairy sector more sustainable. We can look at diversity, the same as even in terms of our grass-based system, where we're looking at multi-species swards and clovers and all that, and where we're looking at where we can reduce our emissions in the water, but also in our air emissions as well. All this can be done. But like you said yourself, it'll be done with the farmers. But if you ask a farmer out there, is the conversation like this working with the farmers? Because so much of it is about saying they are the problem.
No, you're the only one saying that.
I'm not saying the farmer. I never said the farmer was a problem. I said we can work with the farmer. I said we have a water problem, water quality. I certainly didn't suggest that the farmers were the problem.
You said that I said they were the problem, which I didn't. You're the only one saying that somebody's saying they're the problem. But point to me who's saying that. Nobody is. And can I just say,
if you listen
your
to what I
leader
said,
was out saying,
if
we're going to try and arrange a meeting with the Commissioner.
I was accused of cutting across people, and I've been cut across at every turn.
Can I stop you there? I don't want to cut across because we're under extreme tire pressure and I need to move on to just live exports. Holly, you're someone who has been a proponent of ending the live export industry, you know, certainly reducing it in this country. But we are a country practically, not for bad reasons, but practically rely on our live export industry for a very valid reason. How would you propose that we reduce it or even eradicate that particular vein that we have in trade?
One of the obvious things that I think we should have been doing for a long time, and we've had it in all of our alternative budgets, is a zero tax on sexed semen. I think it's one of the things that, you know, the science we could be using in order to ensure that we have less bull calves is an absolute no-brainer. But of course, in terms of breeding, we've been constantly moving towards the only objective being efficiency and increased production, whereas if we could use more of the bull calves in the beef sector, that would obviously have a massive impact as well. And I think, look, when we have this whole kind of scaremongering around the culling of the herd and stuff, it's important to recognise that the kind of unprecedented expansion of that sector has resulted in a lot of culling of these calves, and that's the reality. And there's no point in us feigning this kind of outrage about it when we all know what's been going on. And when that primetime investigates come out, can I just say as well that not one representative from Fine Gael was available to come on to primetime that night to discuss it. It's a head in the sand approach that I would say at a time for the dairy sector that was very worrying, that kind of image of the sector which does not paint a good image of, and it's not an accurate image of all farmers in the country of how they treat their animals. There was nobody out there. There was radio silence. Where are the solutions from government? Would farmers like more of this kind of denial, empty promises, fake gestures, or a bit of honesty and a bit of stability and a roadmap forward?
Colm, Markey, can I just go back to our point there about the tax on the sex semen? I mean, that sounds like it has potential.
I'm all for promoting sex semen, and I'm also all for promoting the dairy beef index that allows to give if you like, an opportunity for what beef calves are there. I also, if you look at my own record in terms of the European Parliament, when the whole debate around animal transport came, I pushed for greater technology usage, for greater tracking to ensure whatever animals were transported in the best possible way, number one, but also that there wasn't any effort to try and break the rules like the documentary was about, that you could put proper tracking and proper monitoring on the lorries so that none of what was to be highlighted in that documentary wouldn't happen. I'm all for sex semen, all for, just to reiterate, the dairy beef index, and all for making sure whatever animals has to be transported are transported in a way that doesn't allow. We don't want these scandals. We want to market the good green product that we have in this country, and things like this don't help that. So the use of technologies to ensure that doesn't happen I think is central to the future.
I'm sorry we're out of time. Thank you very much for my panellists today, MEP Colm Markey and Deputy Holly Cairns, for joining us on the panel discussion. I was a little optimistic about the sunshine coming through earlier when I said I saw it brightening up out there. It's absolutely bucketing it down at the minute. But we are sending our team of Agriland journalists out around the ploughing site again. They're braving the elements today. They'll be absolutely soaked, but sure, it's all good crack. Back to the ploughing site.